Hold on to your butts.
Da-da-da. You were saying?
Welcome to episode 152 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. Tonight, as always, I am joined by my amazing co-host, Darren, also called Canna Darren, for tonight's episode, and I am just Mary.
Maple Leaf Mary.
Yeah, Maple Leaf Mary.
What's
there we
going
go.
on? How we doing?
See, that's why you should have done the intro, because you would have said, you know,
You know what I was going to say. I can't remember mine. Anyway, what's going on? How are you?
Maple Leaf Mary. Anyway, I'm good. I'm happy to be back recording again. It's been a few weeks since we've sat down at the old Breakfast Club headquarters and recorded an episode. How are you?
Good. Good to be back. Good to be back. It's warm and steamy out, but it's going to be a good episode, I think. It's always a lot of fun talking about this, but that's how we roll.
No, it is. And so what are you drinking tonight?
Oh, my God. You come out hot today. I didn't think you were going to come that quick.
Yep.
I'm drinking from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, Labatt's Blue. Oh, and I'm drinking it out of my Boston Red Sox mug because I have a Canadian Canada mug somewhere I cannot seem to find.
It's probably still back somewhere.
But that's what I got. So what about yourself?
I am drinking also Labatt's Blue because we decided to make it Canadian for this episode, and I'm drinking it out of my Gettysburg Seminary Ridge Museum mug. And we are going to talk with one of the people we're going to talk about tonight. We will be mentioning Gettysburg. But anyway, tonight is an episode we've been saying we're going to record for a while, and we finally just decided to record it. And that is Canada's involvement in the Civil War, which is a very interesting history to study. And it's something that, like, I've studied it here and there, being as I'm originally from Canada, but never took that in-depth of a look at it until, you know, these past few weeks that we've been researching this episode. Yeah. So I just want to start off on September 16th in 2017, there was a monument to Canadians who served in the American Civil War unveiled near Cornwall, Ontario. Now, this is up near the Quebec border. With words in both English and French, which are Canada's two official languages, the monument is dedicated to the over 40,000 Canadians who fought in the Civil War, both Union and Confederate. Now, more Canadians fought for Union, but yes, there were still some that fought for the Confederacy as well. Over 7,000 of these Canadians were killed during the war, and inscribed on the monument is a biblical verse, Romans 12:21, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil by good." The monument lists the names of Medal of Honor recipients, as well as notable Canadians who played a role in the war. And we're going to be talking, just mentioning here and there, a few of those Canadians in a little while. And they would be soldiers, sailors, nurses, surgeons, and even as part of the blockade, both doing the blockade running and trying to stop the blockade as well. And so, as was mentioned, over 40,000 Canadians enlisted in the Civil War. 5 of them would become Union generals. Jacob Dolson Cox of Montreal, Quebec, John Franklin Farnsworth of Compton, Quebec, John Curtis Gilmore, I could not find out where he was from, Martin Thomas Mann of La Prairie, Quebec, and John McNeil of Halifax, Nova Scotia.
See, if you can't find them, just say they're from Thunder Bay, Ontario.
Yeah, Thunder or Winder. Yeah.
Or Winder, Ontario.
But the interesting thing about this is you notice that Quebec, Ontario, and Nova Scotia are, and the island provinces are kind of the ones that where Canadians came from who fought in the Civil War. The other thing that Canada has, and which began before the Civil War, was the Underground Railway, as we know, which we are planning on doing an episode about that sometime soon. And Canada became kind of the terminus for that Underground Railway. And you and I have been to the spot in Niagara Falls where Harriet Tubman actually brought people across in the Underground Railway. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to talk about what Canada's views are about the Civil War and some of the Canadians who fought in the Civil War, and a little bit of the aftermath of the Civil War, what the effect was on Canada, which it ultimately became a country in 1867.
Yeah, I mean, you think about international countries of this. England, France, the most commonly mentioned countries that impacted the Civil War, but a certain country, like you say, to the north, certainly had a great impact, like you just introed. People don't tend to think of Canada when studying the Civil War, but Canada had a sizable impact, like you said, in both the Union and the Confederates throughout the war. It's also important to remember, Mary, that Canada was not a country until 1867.
We were British North America.
You're a British colony, right? Apparently, you don't have any tea to throw, but that's why you're not. But
we did not throw down in the harbor.
But for real, though, we joke, but in 1775, America tried to take Canada, but was driven back by the Canadian militia, who probably said sorry as they were driving back. French Quebec, like you mentioned, supported the English colonies, which resulted in the Battle of Quebec on New Year's Eve, 1775. who defeated American officers Benedict Arnold, of all people, and Philip Schuyler. But again, Canada was obviously loyal to England in the War of 1812, and when the American Civil War began in 1861, Canada's policy towards it mirrored England. Of course it would. But it would remain neutral, but just like England. But that neutrality will be tested over and over again when we talk about some of these stories. And I think the one event that happened earlier in the war that really epitomized this was, and I think we talked about before, which was the Trent Affair that took place on November 8th of 1861.
Yeah. And it's interesting to note that, so as you said, we talked about the Trent Affair, and we're going to just revisit that in a few minutes. But I just want to mention that, as I said, Canada was British North America. It consisted of the province of Canada, which included parts of modern southern Ontario and southern Quebec, and separate colonies of Newfoundland, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, British Columbia, and Vancouver Island. And there's also a territory administered by the Hudson's Bay Company called Rupert's Land. So it's interesting to note that one of the common misconceptions about Canada in the Civil War is that Canada was 100% on the side of the Union. Well, the majority of Canadians are leaning this way, and many Canadians were against slavery. They were abolitionists. And a majority of them are going to fight for the Union. But even the ones that fought for the Union, like the Americans fighting, it did not necessarily mean they were abolitionists. There was great debate about which side Canada would be on. And just like today, Canada has many close economic and cultural ties with the United States, and this did encourage sympathy towards the Union. And while many Canadians, as I said, largely opposed slavery, there were many politicians, including some of Canada's founding fathers, so our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, businessmen, church leaders, and newspaper publishers all sided with the Confederacy. And in doing the research for this, so I did find some quotes from newspapers. They did take a southern slant. The Montreal Gazette wrote, "All white men who are planters are necessarily slave owners and, of course, interested in the preservation of their lives and property." Another paper mentioned the possibility of slave uprisings. One Montreal newspaper praised the Confederate Army, stating that it was one of the most intelligent armies we have known in America. And a newspaper in Ontario called the Niagara Review, and I just want to say Niagara was one of the more Confederate leaning areas in Ontario. They were not happy with the election of Abraham Lincoln, and they referred to him as a mad, blood-stained despot at Washington. The Toronto Leader was a very pro-Confederate newspaper, and it praised the South for being hardy in their cause. The newspaper also warned that innocent women and helpless children are to be butchered by armed slaves. But not all newspapers were pro-Southern. The Globe in Toronto was founded by George Brown, also an abolitionist, and he also supported Abraham Lincoln. But he was one of the founders of the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada. And he stated, what have we in Canada to do with American slavery? We have everything to do with it. We are alongside of this great evil. And as you said, the outbreak of the Civil War happens, and Canada's going to play a role in that when it happens as well.
It certainly does, and we talked a lot about this before, but I think when you're studying the Civil War, especially Canada and England, if you don't have a really good understanding of that Trent Affair we talked about, you're missing the boat, literally and figuratively. And we're just going to real quick, we'll kind of touch on some basics, what it was again. But this is when you have those two rebel envoys, James Mason and John Slidell, who covertly were traveling to England on the British mail carrier, the RMS Trent. And knowing two Confederate agents were on board, the USS San Jacinto, captained by Captain Charles Wilkes, broke international law by seizing the Trent and capturing Mason and Slidell, later imprisoning them in Boston Harbor at Fort Warren. But again, suffice it to say, the Trent Affair caused a firestorm in Europe, especially in England, where many in the press and government saw this as an opportunity to get involved in America's Civil War on behalf of the Confederacy. And you mentioned the newspapers a few minutes ago. The London Chronicle specifically was stoking the flames of war, calling the arrest of Mason and Slidell American egotism, while openly laughing at Lincoln's U.S. military, especially the Navy compared to that of England. And how does Canada get involved here? It's because England planned to send 14,000 troops to Canada, with another 30,000 to follow. Now, Canada itself had increased its militia to 40,000, to protect the border in case of an American invasion. A British historian, Kenneth Bourne, in his article British Preparations for War with the North, 1861 to 1862, described Canada's military at the time in this way, and as a quote, "The Canadian militia has been allowed to decline into a mere paper state. The active force received a mere 6 or 12 days annual training, and in June of 1861 was a miserably small force." Bourne also described any Canadian war with the United States would include the burning of Boston. So since you're a Canadian, can I ask you a question?
Yep.
How dare you?
Sorry.
I mean, but Canada had no real choice to compete with the American army, over a chance that is, if the U.S. invaded, and they'd get rolled if Lincoln invaded with 50 or so thousand men or more.
Yeah, and that was definitely you mentioned in 1775 that they tried to annex Canada. They try it again in the War of 1812. That was about annexation as well. And what is really interesting is this starts to happen again when Lincoln is running for president. Seward starts campaigning that they're going to take Canada. So this idea of Canada being annexed by the United States, it's happening during the Civil War as well. And Seward's going around when he's, campaigning for Lincoln, and he's saying things like, "Oh yeah, we want to get Canada," and all this stuff. And it was just really, really, I don't know. I found that fascinating that he was doing that. I've always found that fascinating about Seward. But there was one point where he was making a speech in, I think it was Missouri or Mississippi, and he basically alluded again to this wanting to annex Canada. And even during the war, Seward brings it up again, and Lincoln says to him, "I don't want to be fighting 2 wars.
One war at a time."
Yeah, one war at a time. Yeah.
But you're right, though. Something you said a few minutes ago. Canada's population was definitely pro-union. In many abolitionists in Canada, they had banned slavery in 1833 as part of the English colony. But did you know, Mary, Ontario banned slavery in 1793, one of the earliest areas to ban it. And like you said before, Canada became the destination of the Underground Railroad, and countless escaped slaves had made their way to England. But again, you mentioned sort of the population joining. I think some people might be surprised to find out that over 40 to 50,000 Canadians did sign up to fight or serve for the Union.
Yeah, and some of them were living in the United States at the time, but there was also recruitment happening in Canada as well, particularly, in the areas close to the American border. So Southern Ontario, Southern Quebec area, Nova Scotia.
And there was also 2,000 free black men, many of whom are former slaves themselves or relatives of slaves. And we're going to talk about different people throughout this, and we'll spend some time on a couple towards the end. But one of these African Americans was a guy named Anderson Ruffin Abbott. He was an escaped slave from Alabama who was living in Toronto when the war broke out. Now, Abbott wasn't a soldier. What was he? He was a surgeon. And he was actually the first black surgeon in Canadian history. He originally tried to enlist as a soldier, but he was rejected by the U.S. Army. So he went to Washington to help with the hospitals. There in Washington, Abbott became somewhat of a socialite, a hobnobbing with the elite Washington circles, and he became a FOL, friend of Lincoln, right? And we'll talk more in detail about prominent Canadians in the Civil War, like I said. But another one we want to mention is a guy named Calixa Lavallee. He's a musician from Vercheres, Canada. I had no chance I got that spelled right, but there we go, pronounced right.
I believe it's in Quebec.
Lavallee moved to the United States in 1857. When the war started, he enlisted in the 4th Rhode Island as a musician. Now, in 1880, Lavallee will write the music for a song that will become the Canadian national anthem 100 years later. I think it's called "Oh Canada," right?
Oh Canada, yep.
So when you turn on the Maple Leaf games versus the Bruins next year, Mary, right before the Bruins demolish them, you'll be able to hear a national anthem written by a Canadian Civil War veteran.
Yep.
Pretty cool.
I've always found that very, very cool that, he fought, I think he fought for Rhode Island, right?
4th Rhode Island.
4th Rhode Island.
Obviously, you weren't listening.
Yeah. So another thing to mention too is that as much as Canada is saying they're going to remain neutral, they are also going to be a haven for the Confederacy in certain areas. There's going to be cross-border raids, money's laundered, And as we have discussed before, members of the Abraham Lincoln assassination conspiracy were in Canada as well, including John Wilkes Booth, who had Canadian bank accounts, and John Surratt. Surratt fled to Canada after the assassination to evade capture.
He was not an FOL.
No, he definitely was not an FOL. And besides Quebec, the Maritimes was another base of operations for the Confederates. And this is which was in violation of British neutrality. And the Maritimes at the time were trying to maintain this independence for themselves, even from being called in that group of Canada, of British North America. And they are helping out with the blockade. And there's a guy named Benjamin Weir, and he's one of the ones mentioned on the monument in Canada. And he's involved with this. He acted as a Halifax agent for many of the Confederate blockade runners carrying British arms during the Civil War. And they would go to Halifax and repair their ships. And in return for this, the Confederates were supplying him with cotton to send to Britain. And Seward becomes very annoyed with the city of Halifax, saying Halifax has been for more than 1 year and yet is a naval station for vessels which, running the blockade, furnish supplies and munitions of the war to our enemy, and it has been made a rendezvous point for those piratical cruisers who come out of Liverpool and Glasgow to destroy our commerce on the high seas and even carry war to ports of the United States. And while Seward says, okay, the governor of Nova Scotia, he's remaining neutral, just and friendly. On the other hand, the merchants and shippers of Halifax, Seward does not like those guys. And he said that they are willing agents and abettors of the enemies of the United States. And their hostility has proved not merely offensive, but deeply injurious.
Yeah, but there's a lot of them, though. You mentioned, you go to the list, there's a whole bunch of different people. Lieutenant Colonel George Taylor Dennison III. He hated America and he hated all things America. He was a lawyer from Toronto who became a politician. He was the founder of the Canada First movement. There you go. He hated America so much that when England was considering placing a statue of George Washington at Westminster Abbey, Dennison said if they did that, he would travel to England just to spit on it. Now, here's the thing, though, right?
Wow.
It never got built, but in 1921, just 4 years for Dennison's death, a George Washington statue was dedicated, but in Trafalgar Square in London. No word if he followed through on his promise to head to London and huck to it and spit on that thing, right? But in describing Dennison, his biographer, Dr. Norman Knowles, he wrote of his attraction to the South, noting, quote, the South embodied an idyllic society that embodied that social order that he wanted to see maintained in British North America. And like you mentioned, Canada's base for a lot of this stuff, especially espionage, was focused on the Maritimes, which is New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI, Prince Edward Island. And it's ironic that when the Civil War started, about 20,000 men from this region enlisted in the war. Again, mostly for the Union, but there was some for the Confederates. And you mentioned Benjamin Weir. I mean, he was a perfect example of this. Hardcore Johnny Reb. He was a merchant who at the shop, he flew a Confederate flag out his window. I mean, this guy just none given.
He didn't care.
No, he didn't, and he made a lot of money. And the Lincoln administration was very much aware of Weir. Say that fast.
Yeah.
And he was on their radar because he knew those Halifax rebel ties, and was basically a dispatch station between Richmond and England. And many other merchants, besides Weir, openly traded with Confederates and helped ship materials to the Confederacy, and quickly became a real pain for Lincoln. Lincoln was also used. I mean, here's the thing too, though. Lincoln also used Canada to benefit him when it came to undesirables as well.
Yeah, he did.
He famously arrested Ohio Democrat Clement Vallandigham.
Vallandigham.
When he openly denounced Lincoln in speeches he considered treasonous and banished him to Canada.
Yep.
So Vallandigham, he campaigned for governor of Ohio in 1863. He lost to a guy named John Brough. He ran that election while he was in exile in Ontario.
Yeah.
So his internet must have been pretty good for back then. After the war, Vallandigham, who was now an attorney, he's going to die in 1871 when he accidentally shot himself while trying to prove that his client, who was accused of shooting a man in Hamilton, Ontario, Hamilton, Ohio bar, he actually shot himself that he was basically
God.
what he was basically doing was he was trying to show that he could not have shot himself,
Yep.
and I'm going to show you why. And he shot himself, and he was mortally wounded, and he died. By the way, he won the case, and his client Thomas McGahan was set free while Vallandigham was laying mortally wounded.
Wow.
So that's how he died, you know. But I think there's a lot of events that took place in Canada, some that we know about, like a lot of people do, like the Trent Affair. But there's another one that I think is more important that people don't really study.
Yeah, and that is the Chesapeake Affair, which happens in late 1863.
Yeah, this is on December 7th of 1863. Two Nova Scotians, Vernon Locke and John Bain, they got a bright idea one day. They're going to hijack a U.S. vessel called the USS Chesapeake, and they're going to sail it to Wilmington, North Carolina, to be used as a rebel blockade ship. So they put a crew of 16 men together, and on December 7th, seized a ship off the coast of Cape Cod in Massachusetts. During this attack, one of the men, George Wade, he shot and killed an American second engineer named Orrin Schaefer. Now, Vernon Locke took command of the Chesapeake and sailed it north to St. John, New Brunswick, and then finally to Nova Scotia, where it was loaded with coal, and the supplies on board were naturally sold to the locals for a profit. The U.S. Navy heard about this, and they didn't like it one bit, Mary.
No,
Not
they were angry.
They sent two U.S. warships, the USS Malvern and the USS Dakota, to chase the Chesapeake down and take it back. Now, Locke was able to sneak the boat back to Halifax, and then on December 16th, it arrived in Mud Harbor in Sambio, Nova Scotia, where it was found by the U.S. warships, who promptly arrested the men and seized the ships. Now, the event was played big in the northern press. They were
Oh, yeah.
The New York Herald called the Canadian rebels pimps of Jefferson Davis
amazing.
and his fellow traitors. How about that, right?
Pimps of Jefferson Davis.
Secretary of State William Seward, he demanded the Chesapeake return to the U.S. and the rebels executed for piracy.
Yeah, Seward was not having any of it. This is and this is just going to add to Seward's like hatred towards Halifax as well.
It does. I mean, the U.S. consul in Halifax said on Christmas Eve in 1863 of this event, a terrible retribution awaits the city of Halifax for its complicity in treason and piracy. The Lincoln administration wanted these guys bad, but especially that George Wade who killed Orrin Schaefer. Only a miracle could save these men, Mary, and enter a miracle named William Johnson Almond, a doctor and Canadian parliamentarian who just happened to be a Confederate sympathizer. So what does Almond do? He will covertly arrange for Wade to quietly escape on a rowboat, which pissed off the U.S. officials very, very much.
They
Now,
were angry.
there was a bunch of saber rattling going towards Canada back and forth about this Chesapeake affair. Eventually fizzled out for the most part. The remaining conspirators were charged with minor crimes and freed, as Halifax tends to. They protected their own. It's probably why Halifax would become the post-war home of at least 30 Confederate officers, including a guy named John Taylor Wood, the naval hero of the Confederacy who fought on the CSS Virginia at the Battle of the Ironclads at Hampton Roads versus the Monitor in March of '62. Wood's probably better known, though, for being part of Jefferson Davis' escape party when they were all captured in Irwinville, Georgia on March 10th of 1865. Wood was arrested, but he escaped, and he went to Halifax, where he spent the rest of his life as a merchant. And this is going to continue on and on. These things repeat themselves over with Canada.
Yeah, and I just want to mention to our listeners as well, we are going to be doing a full episode about the Chesapeake affair, because it is something that does not. I just found out about it, which I was like, wow, it's very intriguing. It's happening in 1863, so midway through the war. So we are going to devote a whole episode to that at some point.
But you ever know the picture if you see Seward, he always has a miserable look on his face.
Yeah, no, I know. It's because of Canada.
It's because someone said Halifax.
Oh, yeah.
You just tell
He
what
hated
a pain it was. But you saw a lot of these events repeating itself. And in 1864, another major event's going to happen that almost dragged Canada into conflict with the United States. And we're going to do a whole episode on this as well, but it just seems like they knew they couldn't get involved with Canada, but Canada kept poking them in the eye with the stick using the Confederacy.
Yep.
The event in 1864 we're talking about was when 21 Confederate soldiers arrived in Canada and had a plan to rob 3 U.S. banks to get much-needed cash for the Confederacy. The target of their attack was 15 miles south of the Canadian border in the small town of St. Albans, Vermont, with a population of around 2,000 in 1864. The banks they targeted were the First National Bank, the St. Albans Bank, and Franklin County Bank. And once they secured the loot, hey, we'll just go ahead and burn the town down too.
Yeah. Why not?
Why not?
Why not?
You know, but again, aside from getting some cash, the hope in Richmond also was that Lincoln would have no choice but to send troops to guard Vermont, the border, reducing the total number of soldiers fighting Lee in Virginia. Don't forget, this is the middle of the Overland Campaign.
Yep.
You saw Jubal Early doing his thing, trying to draw troops away. This would have had a nice byproduct. And we'll do a whole episode on this at some point because the whole thing is just hilarious.
It is, and it's to the point where Lincoln mentions it in his State of the Union, and he is just angry. He is saying, like, to Canada, for the recent assaults and depredations committed by inimical and desperate persons who are harbored there, meaning in Canada. And he's specifically referring to the St. Albans raid. And Lincoln was so angry at this that he threatened to get rid of a reciprocity trade, that deal that existed at the time. So he's like, we have this trade deal. Guess what? I'm thinking about getting rid of it. His administration also went on to impose passports for Canadians wishing to enter the United States. And then things started to get really ugly again when there's more threats to invade and even annex Canada in 64. And it's likely because of this coming back again. Like, Seward had done it during his campaigning for President Lincoln. And the one speech that I was talking about that he gave in St. Paul, Minnesota, he said, speaking to Canadians, it is very well you are building an excellent states to be hereafter admitted into the American Union. Now, it is in 1864, early 1865, after St. Albans has happened, that Seward really starts harboring on Lincoln about this again. And that's when Lincoln tells him, I only want to fight one war at a time. Mm-hmm. We're not going after Canada at this time.
No, but we'll talk a little bit about St. Albans raid because I think a lot of people have heard about it, but I think the details what it was. But the leader of the raid was a Kentucky native named Bennett Young, and he was a former member of John Hunt Morgan's Raiders. Young found 11 men to join him, and this is great, under the guise that they were going to Canada for a guy's fishing trip.
Really?
That's how we sold it. Okay.
Jeez.
So,
wow.
On October 19th, 1864, Young and his raiders attacked the town of St. Albans, Vermont. Now, the raiders were yelling, "For the Confederacy!" and the citizens in the town thought it was a joke, and they were laughing hilariously. But in just 12 minutes, Young and his raiders successfully stole $200,000, which in today's money would be just over $4 million. During the raid, a 52-year-old builder from Manchester, New Hampshire, who was ironically born in Fairfax, Virginia, saw what was happening and tried to stop the raid. His name was Linus Morrison, and he was shot and killed trying to stop Young and his rebels. Morrison would have the distinction of being the most northernmost casualty in the American Civil War.
Wow.
Now, with the $200,000 in cash, Young's raiders escaped back into Canada, where they were quickly arrested by Canadian police. Must have been using the wrong bait.
Yep.
You know? But the Canadian authorities, they confiscated $88,000 in cash, which was sent back to the banks in St. Albans. The rest of the money that they stole never turned up, and there have been countless TV shows made about the missing Confederate money with all kinds of stories and legends of what happened. If you know where it is, contact Josh Gates at the Discovery Channel. He'll be thrilled to hear from you. I promise. I promise you will, right? But the raiders, they had their day in court. The Canadian court ruled that since the men were soldiers under orders of the military, Canada could not extradite them back to the U.S. since Canada was officially neutral. Hence, the men were freed. And again, this upsets Seward. That something smells bad look on his face all the time. He's not a big fan of Canada, right?
No, well, I mean, it's just interesting how he's just seemingly like at different points, like just obsessed with annexing the country. You know, like he just wants it like for the U.S.
Just to control it.
Yeah.
But he was livid, but if it was any consolation, the raid really ended any real hopes of another one into Canada, so Lincoln didn't have to waste those troops to send up there. Who would have been in Vermont doing nothing, probably eating Ben & Jerry's ice cream the entire time?
Likely.
Yeah, probably. But again, post-Emancipation Proclamation, England was not getting involved, so another potential international crisis, again, was averted in Vermont. Another Canadian hotbed of espionage was the city of Montreal we talked about, where men like John Wilkes Booth conducted several visits.
Yep, and that's where, as we said, that's where John Surratt went back to. That's where Davis sets up this satellite Confederate government up there with, I think it's his brother or brother-in-law running the show up there. And there was even Canadian banks involved as well, which I was, surprised, but not really to learn that. But this is like Montreal is this that is like Confederate North, I guess you could say, is what it is for the Confederacy.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's not far from the United States. And, it's ironic that just north of Montreal in the small town of Wickham, Quebec, would be the birthplace of the man who would ultimately be Booth's undoing, and that's Edward Doherty.
Yep.
Right? Well, let's talk a little about Edward Doherty here real quick. Edward Paul Doherty was born in Wickham, Quebec on September 26th of 1838. Some people say 1840, but who cares, right? Yep. It doesn't matter. He's not saying anything. His parents were Joseph and Mary Doherty, Irish immigrants from County Sligo, where at this moment a sunburned American tourist from D.C. is likely looking for a Guinness. Doherty attended school in Montreal and in 1857 graduated from Hyacinth College. He studied law for a couple of years, but in 1859 he shipped up to Boston, where he took a job at a store selling dry goods. Now, a year later, he moved to New York City when the Civil War broke out. He enlisted in Henry Martin's 71st New York, and he signed a 90-day paper effective April 20th of 1861. He found himself at Ambrose Burnside's brigade in a division commanded by David Hunter in Irvin McDowell's Union Army of Northeastern Virginia. Now, on July 21st, 1861, there was a battle.
Yep.
Doherty participated in the first Battle of Bull Run, Manassas Junction, and he was a witness to the disaster that was that battle. A desperate Doherty dragged some of his wounded comrades to a nearby church that was serving as a field hospital. And then he ran back to the battlefield to rejoin what he thought was his regiment. When he made it across the hallway, across the field to his regiment, it turns out they were Confederates. And he wrote an article in the New York Times. He wrote, "The cavalry galloped up to me and arrested me." That's what it was. He was one of 1,300 captured or missing Federal soldiers this battle. The Confederates held Doherty and other prisoners in a nearby church, again, that had turned into a field hospital. And again, he wrote in another quote from this article, "During the confusion, I managed to conceal myself under a blanket which was saturated with blood.
Oh.
They left me supposing I was wounded. The healthy prisoners were being marched away to Richmond, Virginia. Doherty had no intention of going to Richmond, so he and 2 other captured soldiers saw an opportunity and they ran like Howard. They took off.
I was wondering when the Howard reference was going to come in.
They snuck past the guard, ran all night, and for 7 days across railroad tracks, fields, forests, probably multiple clown attacks.
Ran into the Rosewoods clown.
I wouldn't mess around
Wonder
with
if he was on a motorbike this time.
I'm going to see. But they finally made it back to the Union camp. But Doherty's bravery was definitely noticed, especially by the Confederates, when they learned he was Canadian. One unnamed Confederate described Doherty as, quote, "that gallant officer." There you go. Okay. A few weeks later, on August 9th, his papers expired and Doherty mustered out of the Army. Now, here's the thing. During his short time as a prisoner, Doherty met a man named Michael Corcoran, a founder of the Fenian Brotherhood and a close friend of Lincoln, who was also captured at Bull Run while leading his 69th New York militia. Corcoran was an Irish immigrant also from County Sligo. Maybe he'll run to that tourist too. The same place where Doherty's parents were born. When he mustered out of the Army, Doherty enlisted as a captain in Corcoran's Legion because he met him while they were prisoners. Wow. Corcoran's the one who fell off the horse and died at Fairfax. So you can read about his story. He's a fascinating guy. But Doherty will spend the next 2 years of the war with Corcoran's Legion, and he did very well with them defending Washington from a rebel attack. In September of 1863, Doherty was in Washington, joining the 16th New York Cavalry as a first lieutenant. The 16th New York Cavalry was in charge of covering the defenses of Washington, D.C., in operating against guerrillas. Their job was to protect the city, and Doherty did a good job for the most part. His job was to protect the city, not the president. On April 14th, 1865, there was a play that night in Washington, Mary, and Abraham Lincoln was there, and unfortunately he would be shot by John Wilkes Booth, who snuck into the presidential box, and he fired a single bullet into the back of his head with a .44 caliber Philadelphia Derringer. Booth rode away on horseback, crossing into Maryland, where he met a fellow conspirator, Davy Herold. 10 days later, Doherty's going to be sitting on a bench in Lafayette Park across from the White House. And Doherty wrote in his quote, "It was my day off, and I was rejoicing my soul in the bright rays of the spring sun."
Rejoicing my
He's
soul.
absolutely a Canadian.
Wow.
But soon later, a messenger rode up with him with new orders. Doherty was told that his commander in the 16th New York Cavalry had been told to find a reliable and discreet commissioned officer, meaning him, and 25 men to equip with 3 days of rations. Doherty rushed back to the barracks, and then he went to the War Department, where he was told to report to Lafayette Baker. Baker ran the National Detective Bureau and sometimes was known as the National Detective Police Department. There was no FBI, there was no Secret Service at the time. Baker was a tough fella, and he had the reputation of being brutal and being corrupt. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Baker had been tasked by Edwin Stanton to oversee the investigation into the assassination. Doherty said in a quote, "Colonel Baker handed me photographs. They were pictures of Booth and his accomplice, Herold." Doherty then realized he was going to be the guy who was put in charge of hunting down the accused conspirators behind the assassination of President Lincoln. But here's the thing, though. People don't really study a lot of this aspect of the assassination. Baker was corrupt. He brought in two of his own civilian detectives to accompany Doherty, his cousin Luther Baker, and a former cavalry officer named Everton Conger. Doherty was in charge of the military regiment, but soon a measuring contest kind of set in between him and the civilian detectives. Later, they would each claim that they played a major role in what ultimately happened, probably due to the reward the government was offering to capture Booth. And we'll talk about that. The government got word that Booth and Herold were hiding out near the Potomac River, which divides Maryland and Virginia, and the Rappahannock River is further to the south. Now, Doherty led the search party through the night, first by ferry and then on horseback, south down the Potomac River and into Virginia. He got to the shore of the Rappahannock River late in the afternoon on the 25th of April, and they noticed a fisherman who ran a ferry and showed him pictures of the fugitives. The fisherman goes, "Yeah, I recognize them," explaining that the day before he and a couple of Confederate soldiers, he'd helped him cross the river into Virginia. And Doherty said, quote, "We concluded that we were on their track." Well, no kidding, okay? Now, they got a bigger tip, actually, from the fisherman's wife, who told Doherty that Willie Jett, one of the 3 Confederate soldiers who had helped Booth, was at a hotel at Bowling Green, less than 20 miles away, visiting his girlfriend at the Bowling Green Bang Barn. Okay?
The Bowling Green Bang Barn.
Now, the Federals rode to the hotel and found Jett, who told them, "Hey, I don't know anything about this Booth guy. What are you talking about?" But Doherty wrote of what happened next in his official report of April 29th of 1865. He wrote, quote, "We took Jett downstairs and informed him of our business, telling him that if he did not forthwith information of where the men were, he would suffer, that no parley would be taken." Jett finally fessed up to Doherty and told him that Booth was hiding in a nearby farm owned by a guy named Richard Garrett. Now, Doherty said that they arrived at the Garrett farm in the pitch-black early morning hours of April 26th. Doherty's men and his detectives surrounded the barn and on the property where the Garrett said Booth was sleeping with Herold. Now, Doherty noticed a large crack on one side and stationed Sergeant Boston Corbett to stand and watch that corner of the barn. Doherty wrote in his report, quote, "Booth at this time was a very defiant and refused to surrender. Considerable conversations now took place between myself, Booth, and the detectives. We threatened to burn the barn if he did not surrender. Booth then offered to send out his accomplice, Davy Herold. And he said, quote, 'Oh, Captain, there is a man here who wants to surrender awfully bad,' Booth said. Harold stuck his hands through the door. Doherty grabbed his wrists and pulled him out. Booth then yelled, I own all the arms and intend to use them on you, gentlemen. Doherty, hearing this and realizing Booth wasn't going to surrender, he ordered the men to torch the barn. And then all of a sudden, bang! A single gunshot was heard over the sounds of the flames, and the building turned into a different kind of bang barn. Okay? Doherty assumed Booth had shot himself, and he ran into the barn to basically grab him. Doherty wrote later in an interview with the Brooklyn Citizen, he was dazed for a moment, and his eyes bore that piteous expression characteristics of a hunted deer. He bent down forward as if to make a spring, raising his right hand, ran his finger through his heavy hair as if collecting his thoughts, and then slumped down and collapsed on the floor of the barn. Doherty realized that Booth didn't shoot himself. It was fired by Corbett, the trooper that Doherty had stationed at the corner of the barn. And a quote in the magazine, Century Magazine now, Doherty did a lot of interviews.
Yes, he definitely got on the tour circuit.
So he said, quote, Corbett, seeing by the igniting hay that Booth was leveling his carbine at either Harold or myself, fired to disable him in the arm, Doherty later said. But Booth making a sudden move, the aim erred, and the bullet struck Booth in the back of the head about an inch below the spot where the shot had entered the head of Mr. Lincoln. Not 100% accurate, but, whatever. Yeah. Okay. The soldiers gathered around Booth and moved him from the fire to the front porch of the Garrett home. Quote by Doherty, Booth asked me to raise his hands. I lifted them up, and he gasped, useless, useless. By 7 a.m., Booth was dead. Now, here's the thing, which gets fascinating. Usually when you hear this story, this is kind of where the story ends, right? Doherty and his men began to rifle through Booth's pockets, where they found his diary, a knife, 2 pistols, a compass, a couple of DQ cards, and a Canadian note for 60 pounds. Now, the banknote in Booth's pocket was money he had taken out of that Ontario Bank branch in Montreal you mentioned during a trip to Canada just 6 months earlier. It must have been a strange feeling for Doherty to see the Canadian note, considering where he grew up in that same area. Yeah. But again, the story does not end with Doherty there. It was the end of the hunt for John Wilkes Booth, but just the beginning of trying to score that reward money and ultimately his reputation. The reward for Booth's and Harold's capture was a cool $125,000, almost $2.5 million in today's money. Wow. So in May of 1865, Doherty wrote to Henry Halleck, the Army's chief of staff, with the names of the soldiers who had served under him. Doherty wrote, quote, my command and myself claim the honor of having effected the capture of the assassins, and we respectfully ask that the reward be offered, properly distributed where it belongs. He sent the Army's top brass affidavits from 13 of his men, confirming that he, Doherty's leadership, was instrumental in chasing down Booth and Harold. But here's where Lafayette Baker gets involved. Lafayette Baker and his 2 civilian appointees, Conger and Luther Baker, did not want Doherty and his men to get the glory or the cash. In December of 1865, they told Secretary of War Edwin Stanton that not only did Doherty not lead the regiment, but he said he was hidden under a shed during the capture, which was a lie that was no support by any of the witnesses. According to Conger and Luther Baker, it was Lafayette Baker who was the leader of the manhunt, even though he never left his Washington office. Baker claimed that he was the one who, quote, apprehended both Booth and Harold and is entitled to the reward primarily. Stanton is like, you've got to be kidding me. He ends up forming a special judicial committee to determine what actually happens. And when the report came out in April of 1866, they sided with Doherty. The quote was, the expedition was eminently of military character. Its special duty was to scout through the considerable region of country lately with the enemy's lines and inhabited by a class hostile to the government. Lieutenant Doherty is shown to have acted and have been recognized as the commander of the expedition. Doherty ultimately got the largest share of the award, $7,500, about $150,000 today, twice as much as what Baker and each of his detectives got. But Baker wouldn't give up. Baker was pissed, and he pulled his political connections in Congress to have a new hearing into, quote, the fairness and propriety of the reward payments. Giles W. Hotchkiss, a New York congressman and Baker ally, said, quote, I believe Lieutenant Doherty was downright coward in the expedition. Doherty stayed under a shed, and no power could drive him out, while his frightened men were lying under the apple trees and elsewhere.
Oh my God.
So what happens next? The committee votes to give Baker the bigger share and cuts Doherty's payment. In the end, Doherty got $5,250, about $100,000 today. But the House of Representatives did ultimately cut Baker's portion, primarily because they hated him.
Yeah.
Doherty was livid at the lies told by Baker in Congress. In an interview with the New York Times, he said, quote, I cannot remain quiet under such a charge affecting my character as a soldier and my conduct as an officer. Chance has connected my name with a great historical event, and I simply desire that the army with whom I served and the people whom I fought should know that in the performance of my duty, I was not a laggard nor a coward. Doherty will join the 5th U.S. Cavalry as a second lieutenant on April 19, 1866, and he'll stay there till 1870 or so. He will retire from the military in 1871 and move to New Orleans to set up a new business. There he got married on November 7th of 1871 to Catherine Gaudier, the daughter of Charles Gaudier, who owned a fancy French restaurant in Washington on 252 Pennsylvania Avenue called Gaudier's. Okay?
Original.
Now, this is where life is funny and ironic at the same time. Back in March of 1865, a party of 4 arrived for a late-night dinner at Gaudier's. The men were John Wilkes Booth, Davy Harold, Lewis Powell, and George Atzerodt.
Wow.
At that dinner, they discussed a plan to kidnap Abraham Lincoln, which ultimately led to the assassination. The fact that the dinner was held in a restaurant owned by the future father-in-law of a man who would catch and kill Booth is one of history's greatest ironies. It really is. Doherty lived in New Orleans until 1886, where he moved back to New York City at a house at 533 West 144th Street, which still stands today.
Wow.
In New York, he lived out his days working as an inspector for street pavings. He died at his home on April 3rd of 1897 and is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His gravesite reads, commanded a detachment of the 16th New York Cavalry, which captured President Lincoln's assassin on April 26th of 1865. So when you look at Doherty's story, he kind of came from nothing, from nowhere, rose up, and again, whether it be xenophobia towards the Canadians or political effort against the military, you can see how they tried to stick it to him. He kind of got a raw deal, but at the end of the day, I think he cared more about his honor than he did for the money.
I think he did too. That's how he comes across. And this kind of leads into another thing to discuss with this, is the assassination of President Lincoln does show that there is division in Canada during the Civil War. One newspaper wrote, the bells are tolling mournfully. Strong men weep in the streets. The grief is widespread and deep. Other newspapers had the opposite view. It must be remembered that as atrocious as was Booth's deed, his sic semper tyrannis was literally justified by the facts. The man he killed had murdered the Constitution of the United States. So obviously they are not an FOL friend of Lincoln. No. They did not like him. This newspaper was the London Examiner from Ontario. The Le Canadien, real original name there, from Quebec newspaper, mentioned they feared for the terrible reprisals against the South that would come. It also went on to warn against those that were already putting Abraham Lincoln on a pedestal, stating just a few days ago he was but a mediocre man. The Globe, a very pro-union newspaper, mentioned earlier, stated that Lincoln, that he was patient, prudent, courageous, honest, and candid. He is dead, but his principles live after him. So even in this, with Lincoln's assassination, it's showing the division, that there is this division in Canada over how they feel about it and how they feel towards Lincoln. Obviously, some of them see him as a tyrant, some of them see him as a great president and as a great man. And that's much the same way it was in the United States when Lincoln was assassinated. So you've mentioned Doherty as a very notable Canadian, and you also mentioned the surgeon too, and now his name is escaping me.
Well, it's a bunch of different people
Yeah.
here and there. So but
Yeah.
just to focus on one specifically,
Yeah.
Doherty was the one I wanted to focus on.
Yeah,
Certainly.
yeah, and he is one of the names that is on the Civil War monument that I mentioned earlier in Canada, and he's one of many names on there. And so, as we said earlier, the Canadians in the Civil War, played different roles. Whether it's like Benjamin Weir in the blockade, he's assisting the Confederates, or whether it's like Doherty is helping hunt down Lincoln's assassin. There was another guy he was involved on the Union side of the blockade, and his name was Lieutenant Samuel L. Preston, and he is from London, Ontario. He was a flag lieutenant to Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter on the North Atlantic Blockade Squadron, and he was killed on January 15th, 1865, while leading the amphibious assault of sailors and Marines at the Second Battle of Fort Fisher. Since his death, 6 U.S. naval ships have been named the USS Preston after him. Another Canadian, Major David B. Bridgeford of Ontario, was Provost Marshal to General Stonewall Jackson, so he's fighting on the Confederate side. He is going to be present at the Appomattox surrender on April 9th, 1865. Dr. John Lang Bray of Kingston, Ontario, would serve as a Confederate Army surgeon in Richmond, Virginia. He would later become president of the Canadian Medical Association. Lieutenant William Winter Cook of Hamilton, Ontario, was part of the 7th U.S. Cavalry. He would be wounded at Petersburg, and he would end up at the Battle of Bighorn in 1876, where he is killed. He is buried in Hamilton, Ontario. So if we have any listeners in Hamilton, Ontario, you can go visit his grave. Franklin Devereux of Quebec enlisted with the 16th Maine, and he will be killed here at Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863, likely in that salient. Along with Charles Tilden was not killed, but Charles Tilden led the 16th Maine, and that's who this Canadian served with. Private Oliver, I'm going to butcher his name, Private Oliver R. Tarji Zeke was an Indigenous Canadian born in Walpole Island, Ontario, and he enlisted with Company K of the 1st Mississippi Sharpshooters, or 1st Michigan Sharpshooters on June 17th, 1863. He will die on July 9th, 1864, from wounds he received in battle. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery as well. Sergeant James McLaughlin of Toronto, Ontario, would serve with the 21st Mississippi, and he's going to be killed in the wheat field at Gettysburg and is buried in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. Reverend Dr. James Beach Moore was an aide-de-camp to General Phil Kearny, and he was from Norwich, Ontario. And he was born in 1842, and he passes away in 1931 and is apparently the oldest Canadian survivor of the Civil War. So he is... and there was also many African Canadians who enlisted in the Civil War, as you said at the beginning. And they enlisted with the 54th Mass. John Weeks, no idea if he's related to you or not, and Silas Garrison of Chatham, Ontario, were both killed in the assault on Fort Wagner, unfortunately. Moses Jackson and Elias S. Rouse, both from Walden, Ontario, were wounded at Fort Wagner. The 20th USCT had 20 Canadians in their ranks, and the 102nd USCT also had Canadians who had listed. William Reeves from Cornwall, Ontario, was part of the Iron Brigade and would serve as a member of the Honor Guard at Lincoln's funeral. And you mentioned Anderson Ruffin Abbott, the first Canadian Black surgeon. I had a quote from him, and he said that those fighting for the Union side were modern crusaders fighting for a just cause. We've already done a few episodes too where we've actually detailed some notable Canadians too. In an episode where we discussed women in the Civil War, we discussed Sarah Emma Edmonds, also called Franklin Flint, because she disguised herself as a man and served in a Michigan regiment. And just to quickly recap her story, Sarah was from New Brunswick and ran away to the U.S. when she found out that her father had arranged a marriage for her. And it was at the time of the outbreak of the Civil War. She ends up disguising herself as a man and enlisting in a Michigan regiment. She's going to go on to, she's wounded, and before they can discover who she is, she escapes. And she then becomes like a nurse, and she does a bit of spying as well. And after the war, she approached men from her regiment and told them her story, said that I am Franklin Flint. And they obviously believed her. And anyway, Sarah ends up getting a pension. Another one that we discussed was Sergeant John A. Huff, who served in the 5th Michigan Cavalry under General George A. Custer. He is one who is said to have shot Confederate Jeb Stuart at the Battle of Yellow Tavern on May 11th, 1864. And that's the episode where we would have talked about him. And Huff would be fatally wounded a few weeks later on May 28th, 1864 during the Battle of Hawes Shop. He is buried in Armada, Michigan. Now, the one other Canadian that I wanted to mention is from my area of Canada, southwestern Ontario. He was actually from a town that is about 30 minutes north of my hometown. I'm originally from Goderich. And this gentleman is Solomon Secord. And he was born on May 24th, 1834 in Stony Creek, Ontario. He's the great nephew of Laura Secord. Anybody who studied War of 1812 will likely recognize her name. She overheard a conversation that American troops were having one night, and she went and told the British troops, and they found out that the American troops were planning a surprise attack. So she's very much a hero in Canada. Solomon graduated from Victoria Medical College in Toronto, and he first worked in Hamilton, Ontario before he settles in Bruce County. When he's in Bruce County, he's going to live in Southampton and Walkerton, but finally he's going to settle in Kincardine. Dr. Secord ends up traveling to Georgia around the time secession is happening, and his father had warned him not to go because of secession, but for whatever reason, it's not really clear. Allegedly, it might have been for his health that he wanted to go down there for the climate because he had been ill and he thought that it would help his health. There are some stories that his abolitionist views when he was living in Georgia did get him into trouble. And apparently he was almost executed for it, but people in the town he lived in spoke up for him and he ends up being released. And when the Civil War broke out in April of 1861, he signs up as a surgeon, and he's going to serve in the 20th Georgia Regiment of Benning's Brigade in Hood's division of Longstreet's Corps. This is the same regiment that the people who had spoken up for Secord also are going to serve in as well. So it's not really known why Secord, signed up, why he joined, but he does that, and he's very sought after because surgeons who were trained in Canada, they train differently than American surgeons. The surgeons in Canada trained on cadavers, and because of this, they could perform amputations fairly quickly. And so Secord is going to be considered to be one of the most skilled surgeons on the battlefield with being able to amputate a limb in 10 minutes. And because of this, he's able to save many lives. Secord is going to be at the Battle of Gettysburg over at the Plank Farm, where he's going to be operating for nearly 24 hours straight on both Union and Confederate soldiers. After the Confederate Army retreated, he remained behind caring for both Confederate and Union soldiers. Secord ends up getting captured after the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, this is where his story starts to get a little bit, there's different versions of it. Some sources state he was a surgeon at a prison for the remainder of the war, and other sources state he was released because he was deemed a non-combatant, and he returned to serve as a surgeon in the Confederate Army. Either way, he returns to Kincardine after the war, where he is a doctor in that town for almost 50 years, and he's a very respected and well-liked resident. He was known for treating patients for free, or they would give him items, so they might give him something that they had been growing as one of their crops. Secord would pass away in Kincardine in April of 1910. His last words were said to be, "Give my love to everyone." He is referred to as one of the best-known physicians in Bruce County. And the citizens of Kincardine had a monument. They had two monuments placed for them. One is out in the cemetery, and you can still visit it today, and it reads, "Erected by his friends to a man who was unalterably opposed to all forms of insincerity, cant, and hypocrisy. He loved children and animals and was rich in all things worthwhile. His life was devoted to benevolence and charity, and he still lives in the affection of the people." And there was also a monument it had a home outside of the library in Kincardine for many, many years. And the inscription on it read, "To Solomon Secord, 1834 to 1910, our family physician for 50 years. This memorial was erected by his loving friends, served as surgeon with the Southern Army during the American Civil War. All that lived he loved, and without regard for fee or reward, he did his work for love of his fellows." Unfortunately, a decision was made not to put the monument back after it had been removed for construction when construction was being done in the area where it was. But the monument in the cemetery is still there. You can go visit that today. But I just found Solomon to be I've always found him to be a very, very interesting story. This surgeon he's here at Gettysburg and, operating for 24 hours. We don't know if he encountered Hood. Solomon was likely one of the more skilled surgeons. So he may have seen Hood after Hood was wounded, but we don't have any proof of that. So we can't say one way or another. But Secord was the one Canadian that I really wanted to go into detail about with this episode.
No, I think it's a great one. I mean, you look at how important all these people were in their different things. There were some who fought for the Confederacy, or they served the Confederacy. There's some for the Union, and vice versa. And there were some spies who got a little bit of everything, I suppose. But,
yeah, well, Sarah Edmonds apparently did a little bit of spying. There would have been others as well, but there was many more written on the monument. I wish we could have mentioned all of them, but I just had like a quick list of some of the more, the notable ones, and just the ones that, were killed at Battery Wagner with the 54th Mass as well.
Anniversary's coming up for that.
Yeah,
too.
it is.
So that's why it's important to study these things. We can go on and on about these things, but I think it's important to kind of get a good flavor for it and kind of touch on some things. Canada and the Civil War was important because even though it was still part of England and had shared a border, they were always under the fear that the Americans might try to, if they lost the South, they would try to get the land back by going further north. There was always that fear for them. But again, you have a situation where you're trying to stay neutral, but you can't control your people. And you have the Maritimes doing the thing with the espionage. You have the Quebec doing the thing with the spies. But meanwhile, you have people sign up for both and both sides and fighting. So it's fascinating. Like we said at the beginning of this, England and France get a lot of the talk when you're talking about foreign relations with the American Civil War. It's unavoidable. But at the end of the day, I don't think Canada should be below either of them in the big picture with this, because even though England supplied a lot of the blockade runners and there was always a threat of recognizing the South, Canada they rolled their sleeves up and they got dirty in this.
Yeah.
And whether they wanted to or not, they certainly did. Whether it touched everything from politics to the military to medicine, the Canadians were everywhere.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important to study them and to realize that despite the fact that they probably don't get enough credit as they probably should, they really should be.
Because we're British North America, we're not a country yet. We often get lumped in with, being British. And I think it's important too to discuss that, the aftermath. There is an aftermath for the Civil War, obviously, not just here in America, but in Canada as well. And, most notably, Canada is going to become a country in 1867. But before we get into that, there are some prominent Confederates that are going to make their home in Canada after the Civil War. General Jubal Early was one, and Confederate President Jefferson Davis was another. Jefferson Davis is going to live in Montreal starting in May of 1867 after he had been freed from prison on bail. Verena, Davis's wife, and his children were already living in Montreal by that point. Davis would live at the corner of St. Catherine and, ironically, Union Street, a department store that is there now. And up until a few years ago, there was a plaque there that was put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And it stated that Jefferson Davis had once lived there. Davis would visit Toronto while he was in Canada, and he had been invited by supporters in Ontario who called Davis our gallant and noble chief. Davis also went to Niagara-on-the-Lake, where he was quite popular. And this is an area I mentioned before. Niagara is going to be an area, like during the Civil War and after, is very much a place where Confederates go. Davis found when he went there a Confederate society growing there, and this is what was reported by the New York Times. Davis said of Canada, "May peace and prosperity be forever the blessing of Canada, for she has been the asylum for many of my friends, as she is now the asylum for myself." Other Confederates who lived in Canada after the Civil War included Judah Benjamin, John C. Breckinridge, and George Pickett. Just to mention Jubal Early again, he apparently wrote his memoirs in Toronto, and apparently George Pickett lived in Toronto. Many lived in the Niagara area, including James M. Mason, John McCausland, Richard Taylor, who was the son of Zachary Taylor, John Bell Hood, Henry Heath, William Preston, just to name a few more of them. Now, tensions between Britain and the U.S. remained high after the war, and this, of course, includes Canada. And this was made worse by the Fenian raids, in which, another thing we need to do an episode on, in which some former Confederates participated in. The Fenian raids were a primary reason that General Sherman would visit the town of Goderich, Ontario, my hometown, a couple years after the war. And Darren, you and I went there when we're in my town. There's the Sherman tree. which is named after General Sherman because it's a tree that he saw. So it is a witness tree. It's a tree he saw, and he pointed it out when he arrived in Goderich. We also walked by the area where he stayed in one of the hotels, no longer there anymore, but you can see the foundation. And we also found the house where he stayed with a friend of his who had fought in the Civil War, and Sherman went to visit him. And Sherman is going to do this basically, as I said, to tell the people of Goderich that no, the Fenians are not going to come across the lake and raid your town. So on July 1st, 1867, Canada is going to become a country. And this is because of the British North America Act that was passed in British Parliament, and it created the Dominion of Canada. And Canada is going to have two levels of government, federal and provincial. At the time in 1867, Canada is going to consist of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Manitoba, British Columbia, Prince Edward Island, Yukon, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. And in 1949, Newfoundland and Labrador would join Canada. The last area added to Canada was Nunavut in 1999. And up until 1982, July 1st was celebrated as Dominion Day. And now we call it Canada Day. But you still will hear some people say Dominion Day, kind of the ones that would remember it up until it changed in 1982. But that is, one of the after effects of the Civil War is that this is going to put pressure for Canada to become a country because the threats of annexation were real over the years for them, especially when they amped up again during the Civil War. But studying Canada with the Civil War is fascinating. It's definitely a big part of the history of the Civil War. You have things like the Chesapeake Affair and the Trent Affair happening, which almost ruins both times the neutrality. That could have been a huge incident if it had gone worse. And we have William Seward probably hating Halifax by the end of it all, because I think that was a real thorn in his side. But it's a fascinating study, and I'm glad we were finally able to do it. And I learned a little bit more about my home country, which was cool as well.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a fun study. I think we definitely did it justice. So why don't we turn the page on this one, Mary? What's coming up for us next?
So next, we've got a couple episodes planned. No date set yet for them, but we're going to be announcing that soon. So we are going to be doing an episode about the Amish in the Civil War. And we are also going to be doing an episode about General James Birdsey McPherson. Going to head back to the Western Theater. And we're going to try to come up with another battle episode to do. Maybe one from the Atlanta campaign that we haven't covered yet. But anyway, that is what we have on the go here at Civil War Breakfast Club headquarters.
Definitely. So we'll get ready to jump off here. So a lot of fun things coming up this weekend here. We have the anniversary of the celebration, rather, of the burning of Chambersburg. Speaking of John McCausland, if you mentioned him a minute ago. So we're going to be doing that here this weekend. We have a lot of fun stuff coming. So check the calendar. There's a lot of stuff going on as we now move past the anniversaries of Gettysburg, Vicksburg, things like that. And now it's kind of settling into the late dog days of summer in August. Battery Wagner anniversary is coming up. That's next a couple of days. It's tomorrow, actually.
Yeah.
What today's date is. But there's a lot of fun stuff coming, so definitely check it out. There'll be no live this weekend for us. We have some stuff we're going to be doing, but we'll catch up to other ones soon. So any final words from you, Fincheru?
No, thank you for bringing it like you always do. This was a fun, interesting episode to research, and thank you to our listeners for being with us for these past 152 episodes.
Yeah, now we're going to eat some Canadian bacon, go listen to some Anne Murray, and do the rest of the Canadian
and
thing.
Apologize.
And apologize. Sorry.
Your Canadian accent.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, Canada Darren enjoyed this episode as well. Same with old Maple Leaf Mary, so that's pretty good. So, all right, so off I go. Everybody have a great rest of the weekend. Hopefully it cools down one of these days. Probably never, but just in case it does, we look forward to the fall. Off we go. Mary, we'll talk to you all soon. See everybody on the other side.
See y'all later.
Peace out.
Bye.